As the rector introduced the talk, this is about reconstructing the world of Sutton in the late 15th century. So that's the 1480s. One of the strange things about Sutton is that we have pretty good records from the early modern period, from the 17th century, when we have the church records for, and we have other appearances and other documents starting to describe Sutton, but we actually don't have very much in the way of early histories. You've got Marshall's history of Sutton and Cheam, but he was mostly interested in Cheam. And then you also have Robert Smith's history of Sutton, but he's patchy in parts. And he's a useful source, but it's not great. In preparing for today, I have been spending more time than I thought I would with a book called the Surrey Wills, the Archdeaconry Court Spage Register, which are a set of medieval wills that have been recorded within the Diocese of Winchester and come from the area of Reigate and Surrey, and include several from Sutton from this period, including 2 wills left by Alice Stuard. But before I come to Alice herself, I want to dial back to that period of time. In 1792, when Lysons wrote his history of the environs of London, he described Sutton as having 100 households. Going back further, we can deduce from court records that in the 15th century, in our period, there were between, depending on when you look at tenements and rent records, of no more than 45 houses and 45 households, but typically around 21 to 22 households, with an average family size of household, which we know from national records was 4.7 during that period. It puts us in Sutton of a population of around 100 people in Alice's world. And if I draw you closer into St. Nicholas itself, this church looks old. It stands in its environs with monuments like it's been here forever. It has monuments that date from the 17th century. But in fact, this was rebuilt in 1864 when it replaced a medieval building that had been largely changed a lot during the Georgian period and had been essentially reconstructed in the 14th century. So the church in Alice's time was a small church, maybe a third of the size of this building. It would have been and felt crowded. No pews, but the lights within the church would have illuminated patterned pavements, which we know existed because they're recorded as being ripped out at the time of the Reformation. It would have had at least 2 altars, probably 3 altars within the church. The dedication of the church in Alice's time was to St. Nicholas, but in addition to that, there would have been altars to Mary and St. Catherine. A crowded little church where 100 people could gather to hear the priest say Mass. At that time, we know who it was. We know that it was William Morland who was the rector of Sutton. But he wasn't always there. He was a powerful legal authority within the court, with positions later on in his career as Master of the Rolls. He had took an interest in the parish. He wasn't just an absentee, because we know that he and his kinsman, who would become the rector after him, took property and maintained family here in Sutton. We know that there was a priest called Rainier Oldfield. So there was a chaplain living full-time in the village. And we know that from the earlier period that at some point Sutton had been described occasionally as being Sutton Abbas, having some importance at various points, as being an important identity, as being belonging to the abbot of Chertsey. Because the landowner was the abbot of Chertsey, the lord of the manor, and the people would have recognized him as the feudal overlord. The main industry for Sutton, because Sutton's layout determines what you can use the land for. And it stretches from Stane Street, the road running from London down to Chichester, the old A3, no, A24, isn't it? A24. So it's the A24, the London Road, and Stonecott Hill. It stretches from there all the way up to where it's now Belmont and a little bit beyond. Think of that land, and you have got the clay land of Sutton Common. Difficult, heavy to work, without extensive animals to do that. It wouldn't have been choice agricultural land. Coming down into the valley, where the green sand hits the chalk, was the spring line. And so where the Sutton Common Road, where Sutton Green is now, was where the majority of the people would have lived, in a broad stretch that went to Carshalton in one direction and towards Cheam in another. That was the main arable land. Coming south, though, on the shoulder of the North Downs, the land was dry. The only water available were through occasional ponds that formed, or deliberately constructed dew ponds, where the medieval people would have driven oxen up and collected clay from the southern part of the parish, the manor, to create lined hollows. Dew ponds are managed areas to allow for sheep to graze, because without sheep, without water, nothing lives. And there are no streams up on the north of the south of the parish. Sheep was Alice's world. Sheep was the fundamental part of the economy of Sutton during the 15th century and even the 14th century. Everybody worried about the price of sheep. The markets in Surrey, if you were on the Weald, you'd be driving your sheep towards Guildford. Locally, you'd be driving the sheep towards Ewell and Epsom. Or maybe you would drive them north. But Banstead, at one point, the abbot of Chertsey had 6,000 sheep grazing on the downs. The downs you think of as stretching all the way from Barrow Hedges, all the way through to Epsom. A vast area of open land, suitable by the time of the 17th century for horse racing and recreation, but devoid of trees, except for a few standing coppices. Undulating chalkland, closely cropped by sheep. You've got an interesting story that is told about in the 14th century, 100 years before Alice. The abbot gets into a dispute with the Queen because Banstead was part of the Queen's dowry lands. It was allocated to the Queen for her own estate. And you've got an argument that arose because the abbot's greed in putting so much sheep onto the land meant that there was trespassing into the area, the estate reserved for the Queen. And the Queen's bailiffs drove off the shepherds of the abbot and impounded 1,500 sheep, with petitions from the abbot begging their release so they could be taken to the dew ponds because they were starting to die. And the Queen wanted to prove a particular point to the abbot. You don't come onto my land and graze my land without my permission. But within that environment, you might want to think about how much the sheep started to mean to Alice. Well, we got some pricing for her. We got some information about what that meant in terms of the revenue. And there was a lot of anxiety about the price of wool. You can think about how in the House of Lords, the Chancellor used to sit on the wool sack. But here you've got Alice. When she died in 1483. She's a peasant. In later years, some of the people named and the families named in here start to describe themselves as yeomen. But let's say that they are free, but they have no noble status. She was a widow. She is something that in medieval law is called a femme sole. She's leaving a will. She's running a business. No one can tell this Alice what she may or may not do. Somehow we think that medieval women were always put down. But actually, Alice is an example of a woman who's outlived anyone who can tell her what to do. And now she is leaving 77 sheep and a pair or a yoke of oxen and a cow, along with land and buildings and cash. The sheep she had would have grazed largely up, as I said, onto the common land, up onto the downs, which is also common. They would have been sheared around about now, between mid-May and mid-July. And Alice would have taken her 77 sheep and thought about, do I take them to Epsom or do I have them sheared locally? It's more expensive to drive your flock to have some sheared elsewhere than it is to have them sheared locally, the fleeces bundled and then sold. So you can imagine that there would have been over the downs specialist merchants whose job was to buy and sell those fleeces. And if you want to know if you want to impress your friends with the occupation of somebody who buys fleeces, they are a fellmonger. Fellmonger. It's not a common name. Fellmonger is somebody who buys and sells the fleeces or skins of animals. We'll come on to skins as well in a moment. But the fleece takes about 20 fleeces to fill a wool sack. Together that weighs around 132 pounds or 60 kilograms. A mule would have been able to carry 2 sacks. So Alice, just on her bit, would have seen a couple of mules taking her wool away, her fleeces away. Picture now trains of mules carrying those away. Wagons were very expensive. We start to see the wagon trade developing later. The evidence is from the evidence for the wagon usage around Sutton is really the next century. So it would be mule trains carrying that away. Alice would have been lucky to have got £4 for each of her wool sacks at market. That's the retail. Final, once they sold. That's not what she would have got. That's what the merchant may well have got. £4. But if she was able to send 4 sacks to market, that was £16 in 1480. To work out what that was in equivalent, that would be like buying straight off 11 horses, 42 cows, 40 quarters of wheat, or paying somebody for a skilled tradesman like a carpenter or a blacksmith nearly a year and a half salaries just on the disposable cash. There's a lot of money there. And when she died, she asked to be buried in the churchyard of Sutton. To the church, she left a coverlet. For the reparation and upkeep of the church, 20 sheep. To the high altar, and for my tithes forgot, 12 pence. I think this is really nice. You're supposed to give 10% from all your movable goods, and that included the value of the wool. But if she's leaving 12 pence when she's pulling in theoretically the sacks of £4, And it should be £1 she's leaving for not missing the tithes for this year. So this is a deliberate to the local church, because she doesn't want it to go to just want it just to go into the general pockets of the absentee priest. But she interestingly gives 6p to Winchester, the mother church, which I think is also another interesting thing. So the lord of the manor is the abbot of Chertsey. They have supposedly a share in the tithes. She's given some money to Chertsey, but she's also giving money to Winchester. So Winchester is a place she's been on pilgrimage, and the fact she's giving it to Winchester indicates that she's probably been on pilgrimage as well. She has an affinity for the mother church. At the moment, Sutton is in Southwark diocese, and our orbit then is towards London. But in the medieval world, the orbit was not necessarily to London, it was to where your manager was, who the people who you had an emotional tie to, and that was, in this case, Winchester. And she leaves loads of names. She leaves loads of sheep to loads of named individuals. We've got Alice Hitchcock, Walter, my servant, Richard Stuard, he gets a brass pot, Nicholas Brooke, and Emota, his wife. Emota is Alice's daughter, and Emota is a Latin form of Emma. And you might go, oh, Emma, that's a good Germanic name. Maybe that's Saxon. No, none of the names in Alice's will come from the Saxon world. They all come from the Norman world. And Emma, the origin of that name comes from Emma of Normandy, who was the wife of Ethelred. And so the world of her, this is the peasant revolt world almost, is named entirely as Norman names. There are no here names that come from the Saxon world. It had completely gone by this time. So William Mayer, Thomas Wood, William Plaistow, Henry Taylor, Joan Bulk, John Pound, Giles Croucher, John Stewart, John Gilden, Richard Stewart, Matilda Dunning, John Smalley, Richard Cook, John Buckley, Nicholas Brooke, another Nicholas, John. They go on and on. These are all names that they could be in the telephone directory now. A huge amount of familiarization. Now, picking up her will and looking at other wills, we start to see about the orientation of the world around the agricultural produce of the land. I'm so used to paper that I don't really give it a thought. But I mentioned William Morland earlier on as the priest. William Morland himself, although he wasn't the chaplain, the chaplain for our heroine, is actually she was much more inclined to think about Rainier Oldfield, who is this person who is the chaplain here. But the rector was William Morland. And when he died, he left 5 books. William Morland left 5 books. What's interesting about those is that you start to understand that one of them was printed, but the others, so they would have been printed on paper, but the others were manuscripts. One, interestingly, was a manuscript that was based on a printed book. We know that because if you imagine printed books were put into an edition of hundreds, maybe, with the early movable type. If a book was popular, there were businesses that didn't afford a printing press, because a printing press requires investment on capital of having the engine for the press, the heavy metal plates, the people who are used to working with fine engraving to make the movable type. It was cheaper to employ somebody to copy it out by hand. And you could use the tried and tested method of scaling by having 2 people copying from one who would pass the sheet back to another 2 people, and you could scale out your copying. Well, anyway, that's the fact that he left manuscripts. They were written on parchment, which is sheepskin. Just quote something from a very handy little reference from a Belgian museum. I find that talks about the economy of the trade in sheepskin. If I find it, it's going to be Wills. Aha. Now, it obviously depended on the dimensions of the book. But one of the books that we know exists in the collection from William Morland actually appeared in auction, because it went, first of all, into the library of St. Paul's, and from St. Paul's, at some point, it entered into private hands and was then sold some years ago in auction. And that had 218 folios, 436 pages. In the case of that, maybe 4 folios can be cut from one skin. So we're looking at maybe some 70 sheep being required to go into one book. Now, vellum is calfskin, parchment, sheepskin, or goatskin. And the trade would have been immense. And we think about here, there would have been places probably closer to Carshalton where sheep, after being slaughtered, or maybe off further to Epsom where there was running water, they would be able to slaughter and be able to skin and clean and handle the preparation of the skins. Because you needed an amount of water to be able to do that. You also have to think about other aspects of her will as well. Because when she died, one of the riders that she puts into her will was that she asked for wax to be provided for candles every year. So out of the money and the land that she had left her daughter Emota and Richard, her husband, she put a rider that wax for candles should be provided. And suddenly you realize there's an economy based on bees. You have to have bees and beeswax in order to light anything. Again, we're disconnected from that because of the incandescent light bulb or the LED light bulb. But we suddenly realize that the fields around Merton, our closest religious house, would have hummed with bees. One of the side industries of nearly all of the religious houses was the production of candles for religious and secular use. It would have been a major production element. You've also got evidence that in the households, this part of Surrey was a lot of fruit trees were grown. So you've got one of the things that comes up in documents for this part of the North Downs is cider. So beer as well as cider being drunk on the table. And this part, I mention that because there may be some historic element into the fact that there are recipes called Sutton apple pie, which indicate that there is something particular about having Sutton being famous for that. But Sutton is not famous principally for apples. As I've described, it is principally famous and known for its sheep. When it came into the early modern period, and the early modern period is 17th century, so this is 200 years later, there's still a ghost of the value of the sheep. By then, the economy had switched from the wool economy, the valuing the sheep for that, to instead valuing the sheep for their eating quality. Banston Downs and Sutton had very fine cropped grass. It meant that the sheep tended to be smaller. They tended also to be finely flavoured as well. And so you got the rise of rhymes. Sutton for good mutton, Cheam for juicy beef, Croydon for a pretty girl, and Mitcham for a thief. The collector of this is from a guy called Twistleton Dyer. He collected a lot of Surrey folklore. Slightly tucked away, he does record another version of this, which starts to indicate the market towns. I have to say, Sutton, none of these rhymes, which would have come from Sutton, are ever rude about Carshalton. They're never rude about Carshalton. Why are they never rude about Carshalton? Because that's where the mill was. And you are obliged to take your grain and mill it where the Lord of the Manor is. To use the Lord of the Manor's mill. So they're never rude. They know which side their bread is buttered. So they're never rude about that. But the last thing to say, Sutton for mutton, Churchyard for beeves, another dialect word for cattle, Epsom for whores, and Ewell for thieves. Yeah. So the markets were Ewell and Epsom, where most of the sheep went. They didn't have a high opinion of the experience there. Although there are other interesting wills of people who live in Sutton but choosing to leave their money and asking to be buried in Epsom. Probably because of the economic connection and the importance of the markets there. There's more work to be done on the wills. There's more work to be done on the names. But out of a household of 21 properties, along with Alice's wills, the wills of Kellett and Morland and other people recorded inside this little book about about all those spade register, you've got an interesting insight into the names of villagers. Sometimes sad, sometimes interesting. Sad that you've got somebody like John North who asks on June 12th, 1487, so this time of year, asking to be buried in the churchyard of St. Nicholas, Sutton, leaving to the church a heifer, to the light of St. Mary in the said church 2 ewes, and the residue to William North, my father, to dispose for my soul. But if you think that's sad, the thing I like about wills is that they can also tell you something about the medieval world as well. And there's one person I'm going to leave it with to make sure that that I remind you that that everyone is human. And this is the name of William Morland's successor. William Morland, the parish priest at the time of Alice, he hands things over to Kellett, William Kellett, his kinsman. They both come from the north of England. And one of the surprising things about the medieval world is how many people moved about. You get that from the names. But here, William Kellett is described as leaving in his will to be buried in the chancel of the said church at St. Nicholas, to the high altar of the same one surplice and vestment of red satin. Also I will that Elizabeth Nixon may have the tenement in Churchyard to which I dwell for her lifetime. My executor is Hugh Morland. Okay, suddenly, out of left field, what is a celibate priest leaving Elizabeth Nixon for? I don't know. But one of the books that I was wading through was a PhD bit of research into 15th century concubinage and mistresses of parish priests. So I think just outside the parish, he had a special friend. Absolutely. And the other thing about this is that names like Kellet and Moreland are still with us locally. Kellet is interesting because it's the fact that the person who saw this will was Hugh Moreland, part of the retinue that came south with William Moreland and became in Banstead a landowner. And so you see their names appearing there. Part of the Kellet was part of that same retinue. Kellet collides with a name from the south of England called Killick. You might have heard Killick because it appears in the history of Cheam. The people who lived at Whitehall were Killicks, but Kellet was with a different northern name. And I'll talk about that another time, but names where you actually have people changing their names from Lucrece Kellet through to Lucretia Killick by the time she comes to be buried. Okay, I'm going to stop there. This is the world of Alice Stuard. I hope that that's been of interest to you. I'm going to stop now and see if anyone has any questions.